What if I told you there are 30 forgotten Native American fruits that beat modern fruits in every way? For one family, these weren't just a sweet snack. They were the only thing standing between them and starving through a brutal winter. Their entire survival depended on a single harvest. But as they raced against time, a sudden, killing frost swept in, a death sentence that threatened to destroy everything overnight. Instead of panicking, they waited. They knew a stunning secret about the cold, a piece of lost wisdom that could turn this absolute disaster into an incredible gift. What ancient knowledge allowed them to see a killer frost not as an enemy, but as their most powerful ally? Subscribe, it helps these documentaries to reach more people who are interested in forgotten Native American fruits as well, and maybe help them to fall asleep. And drop your city and local time in the comments. It's always fun to see our map light up. The sun of late summer, a heavy golden coin in a hazy sky, found its way through the broad green leaves of the pawpaw grove, dappling the ground in a shifting pattern of light and shadow. It was a warmth that felt old and settled, a heat that had baked itself into the very soil over long, quiet months. This was not the sharp, hopeful heat of early summer, but a deep, languid warmth that spoke of fullness, of completion. The air itself felt thick and sweet, heavy with the scent of the river that moved slowly nearby, a wide, patient ribbon of brown and green water. But more than the river, the air was saturated with another perfume, a fragrance so rich and unique it seemed to be a season all its own. It was the smell of ripe pawpaws, a scent that was part mango, part banana, with a hint of something wilder, a note of deep woods and damp earth. For the family band that rested in the soft shade, this smell was the true calendar. It was the aroma of the year turning, the final, generous gift of the hot months before the coming of the cool, sharp nights. The world was holding its breath, and in that held breath was this offering of incredible sweetness. They had made their temporary camp here for many seasons, in this very grove, where the pawpaw trees grew thickest, their slender trunks leaning over the water as if to admire their own reflection. At the heart of the small group sat the grandmother. Her hair, woven into a single thick braid, was the color of river clay streaked with the white of winter frost. Her face was a map of seasons, of long years lived with observation and patience. The lines around her eyes etched not by worry, but by countless hours of looking closely at the world. In her hands, she held a single pawpaw, its skin a pale, yellowish green, dappled with dark spots that spoke of perfect ripeness. Beside her sat her grandson, a boy of perhaps 7 or 8 summers, his small body still and focused, his dark eyes fixed on the fruit in her hands. He was learning, not from words, not from lessons, but from watching. The grandmother's voice, when it came, was as soft as the moss that grew on the north side of the oaks. "You see here," she murmured, her thumb stroking the thin skin of the fruit. "You do not look for a perfect green. The green means it is still thinking. It is not ready to share its sweetness. You look for the marks. The land tells you when the fruit is ready. It paints the story on the skin." She turned the pawpaw over, her movements unhurried, graceful. Her hands, though wrinkled and old, were steady and sure. They knew the language of plants, the weight of a good stone, the tension of a properly tied knot. She gently pressed her thumb into the fruit's flesh. It yielded slightly, like soft clay after a morning rain. "And you feel it," she continued. "Not a hard press, a question. You are asking the fruit if it is time. If it is too firm, it says not yet. If it is too soft, a mushiness under the skin, it says I have waited too long, and my sweetness is leaving me. But this," she pressed again, a gentle indentation remaining for a moment before slowly fading. "This one says, I am ready for you." She handed the fruit to the boy. He took it with a reverence usually reserved for a sacred object, his small hands cradling it as he mimicked her gentle pressure. He looked up at her, a silent question in his eyes. She gave a slow, knowing nod. That single nod was a lifetime of knowledge passing from one generation to the next, a quiet affirmation that he was learning to listen to the world around him. He set the pawpaw down carefully in a shallow basket woven from river cane, placing it beside a dozen others, each one perfectly, patiently chosen. This was a lesson that no modern school could ever teach. It was a lesson in texture, in scent, in the subtle shifts of color, a lesson in asking instead of taking. It was the first and most important step in understanding that the land was not a resource to be plundered, but a relative to be respected, a provider whose moods and rhythms had to be understood with a gentle heart. A short distance away, closer to the river's edge, the boy's father sat cross-legged on the ground, his back straight, his attention completely absorbed in his work. A fishing net, woven from the tough, fibrous strands of dogbane stalks, was draped across his lap. In one hand, he held a small wooden shuttle, worn smooth and dark from years of use, and in the other, a gauge stick carved from a piece of deer rib, ensuring each mesh of the net was a perfect, uniform size. He was not weaving a new net, but mending an old one. A small tear, likely from a snag on a sunken branch, or the sharp spine of a large catfish, had opened a hole in the careful pattern. His hands moved with a hypnotic, practiced rhythm. The shuttle dipped and rose, carrying the cordage through the loops, his fingers tying a knot that was both simple and impossibly strong, a knot that would hold under the strain of a heavy catch, a knot that his own father had taught him, and his father's father before that. It was a quiet, meditative task. Each knot was a small prayer for abundance, each repaired mesh a promise of sustenance. The net itself was a masterpiece of patience, the result of countless hours of gathering dogbane in the late fall after the first frost, of separating the fibers, of rolling them against the thigh into a strong, two-ply cord, and finally, of the slow, careful work of weaving. To an outsider, it might have looked like a simple tool, but to him and to his family, it was a story. It was a physical manifestation of their deep knowledge of the land, of which plants provided the strongest fibers, of the precise moment to harvest them, of the skill needed to transform them into something that could pull life and nourishment from the depths of the river. The steady rhythmic click of his wooden shuttle against the rib bone gauge was a part of the grove's gentle music, a sound as natural as the buzz of the cicadas in the high branches. Between the father and the grandmother, the boy's mother worked in a circle of fragrant, drying herbs spread out on a tan deer hide. Her domain was one of scents and subtle properties, of leaves and roots that could soothe a fever, heal a wound, or add a warming flavor to a winter stew. The air around her smelled of wild mint, of the spicy tang of yarrow, and the deep earthy scent of burdock root. Her fingers, nimble and precise, sorted through the piles. She separated the delicate leaves from the tougher stems, her eyes scanning for any sign of imperfection, any leaf that had yellowed or been marked by an insect. Her movements were focused and efficient but peaceful. She was preparing for the months of cold, for the time when the green world would be asleep under a blanket of snow. These herbs, carefully dried in the shade and stored in tightly sealed rawhide bags, were their pharmacy, their pantry of flavors. She picked up a bundle of dried yarrow, its feathery leaves crisp to the touch, and crumbled a bit into a small clay pot. This was for fevers. She ran her fingers through a pile of plantain leaves, broad and ribbed, knowing they would be pounded into a poultice for stings and scrapes. It was a quiet, powerful form of alchemy, transforming the fleeting life of summer plants into the enduring wellness of her family through the winter. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, a library of botanical wisdom passed down from mother to daughter, a living understanding of the chemical secrets hidden in the green things that grew along the riverbank and in the shaded woods. Each plant had a spirit, a purpose, a gift. Her work was to honor that gift and use it with gratitude and skill. Her quiet sorting, the gentle rustle of the dry leaves, was another layer in the symphony of the late summer afternoon. The day wore on, measured not by the movement of a clock's hands, but by the slow, westward arc of the Sunday. The shadows of the pawpaw trees stretched longer, reaching across the forest floor like cool, dark fingers. The light softened, turning the golden dapples into a warm amber glow. The heat began to recede from the air, replaced by a gentle coolness rising from the river. The family worked on, their tasks nearing completion for the day. The boy had filled his small basket with a handful of perfect pawpaws, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. His father had finished his repair, the net now whole again, its integrity restored by his patient hands. He tested the new knots, pulling them tight, and nodded to himself, satisfied. His wife had bundled her sorted herbs, tying them with strips of basswood bark before carefully placing them into their respective bags. The peace of the grove was deep and profound. It was a peace born not of idleness, but of meaningful work, of a life lived in harmony with the cycles of the world. There were no deadlines here, no bosses, no clocks to punch. There was only the sun and the river and the fruit. There was the quiet satisfaction of providing for one's own, using skills that felt as natural as breathing. They were a part of this place. Their presence was not an intrusion. They were woven into the fabric of the woods and the water, just as the turtles sunning on a distant log and the kingfisher perched on a sycamore branch were. Their survival depended on this intricate relationship, on this dance of give and take, of listening and responding. The pawpaw grove did not just provide them with food, it provided them with a sense of place, a sense of belonging in the grand, turning wheel of the year. As the light faded further, a gentle breeze stirred the broad pawpaw leaves, making them whisper. It was a soft sound, a lullaby from the trees themselves, a sound of contentment. The day's gentle work was done. The first of the season's final bounty was gathered, and the quiet promise of sustenance was, for another day, fulfilled. As evening began to draw its cool, gray blanket over the river valley, the world transformed. The sun, which had been a golden presence all afternoon, dipped below the western ridge of hills, and its departure painted the sky in streaks of pale orange, soft rose, and a deepening violet. The air, which had been thick with the scent of pawpaws, now began to carry the cooler, damper smell of the river mud and the scent of night-blooming flowers that were just beginning to open their petals in the twilight. The ceaseless hum of the cicadas and grasshoppers of the day slowly faded, replaced by the tentative, chirping calls of the first crickets of the night. A barred owl, hidden somewhere deep in the woods across the river, sent its familiar, questioning call into the growing darkness. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? It was a sound that marked the true end of the day and the beginning of the night's gentle rain. The family gathered closer to the small fire the father had kindled, a bright, living heart in the center of their small camp. The flames licked at the pieces of dry sycamore and oak, casting a warm, flickering light on their faces and making their shadows dance and stretch against the surrounding trees. A small clay pot, blackened from many such fires, sat nestled in the hot coals at the edge of the flames, and from it rose a thin curl of steam carrying the comforting aroma of simmering fish stew, seasoned with the wild onions and dried herbs the mother had gathered. They ate in a comfortable silence, a silence filled not with emptiness, but with the small, familiar sounds of their life together. The soft scrape of a wooden spoon against a clay bowl, the quiet crackle and pop of the fire, the distant call of the owl. The boy, tired from the day's quiet lessons and the excitement of the harvest, leaned against his mother, his eyelids growing heavy. The river flowed on, its quiet murmur a constant, soothing presence. In this moment, the world felt complete, a perfect circle of work and rest, of bounty and gratitude. The baskets of pawpaws sat nearby, their sweet perfume a testament to a successful day. The air was cool now, but it was a familiar coolness, the expected and welcome relief that follows a hot, late summer day. It was a time of deep, earned peace, a moment of profound stability in a world that was always, gently, turning. And then, a change arrived. It was not a sound, not at first. It was a feeling, a subtle shift in the very texture of the air. It began as a whisper, a movement in the highest leaves of the towering sycamores that lined the riverbank. a sound so soft it was almost indistinguishable from the murmur of the water. But this was different. The gentle breezes of the afternoon had come from the south and west, carrying the warmth of the sun-baked land. This new breath came from the north. It slithered down from the high canopy, a current of air that was noticeably colder, carrying a sharpness that did not belong to a summer evening. It rustled through the undergrowth, and the sound the leaves made was different now. Not the soft sigh of the afternoon, but a drier, more brittle rustle, as if the leaves themselves were surprised by this sudden chill. The father, sitting with his back to a large oak, felt it on his bare shoulders, a prickling sensation that made him unconsciously shift, drawing his deerskin tunic a little closer. The boy, half asleep, stirred and burrowed deeper into his mother's side. The small fire, which had been burning with a steady upward pulse of flame, suddenly flickered and danced sideways. Its smoke momentarily whipped away in a swirling eddy. The new wind carried a different scent with it, too. The heavy, sweet perfume of the pawpaws was momentarily pushed aside, replaced by a clean, thin smell, a smell of distant pine forests, of cold stone from the high ridges, of a world that had already shed its summer warmth. It was a scent of elsewhere, a scent of what was to come. It was a northern whisper on the wind, a quiet harbinger arriving long before its time. The grandmother, who had been gazing into the fire, her eyes half closed in contemplation, went completely still. She did not shiver, her expression did not change, but an invisible veil of deep attention settled over her. She slowly lifted her head, turning her face toward the north, and closed her eyes. She was not just feeling the wind on her skin, she was listening to it, reading it, tasting the message it carried on its invisible current. She held this posture for a long moment, while the wind made another pass through the grove, this time a little stronger, making the fire hiss and spit. The father and mother watched her, their own quiet contentment now tinged with a nascent concern. They knew her ways. They knew this was not idle contemplation. She was communing with the season, interpreting a sign they had felt but not yet understood. Finally, she opened her eyes and looked up, her gaze moving past the branches of the trees to the sky above. The last vestiges of sunset had vanished, and the sky was now a deep, profound black, a velvet cloth strewn with countless points of glittering light. "Look," she said, her voice quiet but clear, cutting through the sound of the wind. "The stars." The father and mother looked up, and the boy, now awake and curious, tilted his head back as well. They saw what she meant immediately. On a typical summer night, the stars would have a soft, almost blurry quality, their light diffused by the warm, humid haze that hung in the air. But tonight, there was no haze. The wind had scrubbed the sky clean. Each star was a tiny, sharp point of cold, brilliant light, seeming to hang closer to the earth, as if they were chips of ice suspended just beyond the treetops. They did not twinkle softly. They glittered with a fierce, crystalline intensity. "My grandmother taught me this," she continued, her eyes still on the sky. "When the stars are sharp like this, when they look so close, you feel you could reach up and touch them. It means the cold air has come down from the north. The air is thin and dry. It holds no warmth. A wind, like this, so early in the season, it is a messenger." She lowered her gaze, her eyes finding the father's. "It speaks of a coming frost, a hard one. Soon, a new kind of silence settled over the small camp, deeper than the one that had come with their meal. The word frost hung in the air, cold and heavy. A frost, in the time of the pawpaw harvest, was unheard of. It was a creature of late autumn, a signal that the gathering season was well and truly over. An early frost was a different matter entirely. It was a thief, a potential destroyer, that could ruin an entire season's worth of work and hope. The stakes had shifted in an instant. The comfortable, pleasant task of gathering the last of the summer's fruits was no longer a leisurely ritual. It was now a race. The father's mind immediately went to the other gathering spots along the river, to the wild plums, still hard and green on their branches, which would be ruined by a hard freeze, to the high bush cranberries, which would shrivel and turn bitter. And most importantly, to the persimmons, which were the cornerstone of their winter sweets, a fruit whose entire character depended on the timing of the first frost. A frost that came too early could turn the entire crop into hard, inedible stones. The comfortable rhythm of their lives had just been disrupted by a single cold gust of wind. Their entire plan for securing enough of the land's sweetness to last through the long, hungry months of winter was now in jeopardy. But there was no panic in the small camp. There was no wringing of hands, no outcry of despair. These were a people who understood that the land gave, but it also challenged. Their survival was built not on the hope for perfect conditions, but on their ability to adapt and respond to the land's every mood. The grandmother's wisdom had not brought them a reason for fear. It had brought them a warning, and with that warning, an opportunity. She looked at her daughter, the boy's mother, and saw the focused, calculating look in her eyes. The mother was already taking inventory in her mind, thinking of the baskets, the drying racks, the journey ahead. The grandmother then looked at her grandson, who was watching her with wide, serious eyes. She gave him a small, reassuring smile. "The frost can be an enemy," she said, her voice calm and steady. "It can steal the harvest from those who are not paying attention, but it can also be a friend. For the persimmon, the frost is not a killer. It is a key. It is the cold that unlocks the sweetness." In that moment, the true nature of their new reality became clear. The frost was a dual-edged sword. It could ruin them, or it could bless them. Their survival, the sweetness of their winter, now depended entirely on their timing, on their knowledge, and on their willingness to act on the subtle message carried by this northern wind. The focused, methodical purpose took over. The mood of rest was replaced by one of quiet preparation. The father rose and carefully banked the fire, pushing the outer coals inward to create a deep, hot bed that would smolder safely through the night, ready to be revived at a moment's notice in the pre-dawn dark. The mother began to check the family's traveling packs, her hands moving with sureness as she confirmed the location of the fire-starting kit, the spare sinew, the awls and tools they would need on a longer journey. The pawpaws they had already gathered were carefully wrapped in broad catalpa leaves to protect them from bruising. The herbs were secured in their bags, the knots pulled tight. There was no need for discussion. They were a single unit, their actions flowing together seamlessly, guided by a shared understanding forged over a lifetime of living this way. They knew, without a word being spoken, that they would leave the pawpaw grove before the sun returned. Their journey, once planned for a week from now, would begin in the morning. A new path had been chosen for them, not by their own will, but by a whisper on the wind. As they finally settled down for a few hours of sleep, the sounds of their preparation faded, replaced once again by the cold wind sighing in the trees. The stars above shone with that same sharp, merciless brilliance, a silent, glittering map of the cold that was marching down upon them from the north. The journey for the harvest had now become a pilgrimage to meet the frost. The departure from the pawpaw grove happened in the deep, velvet dark that precedes the dawn. The world was still and silent, holding its breath in the cold air. The only light came from the stars, those same sharp, crystalline points that had delivered their cold message the night before, and from the reborn heart of their small fire, which the father had carefully coaxed back to life from the glowing embers he had banked hours earlier. He had fed it a handful of dry twigs and bark shavings, whispering to the small flame, encouraging it as it caught, grew, and finally cast a warm orange circle of light around them. There was no need for spoken words. Each member of the family moved with a quiet, efficient grace, their actions a well-practiced dance. The mother secured the last of their bundles, checking the knots on the deerskin packs with knowing hands. The grandmother scattered the remaining ashes of the fire, a final, respectful gesture of returning what they had used back to the earth. The boy, bundled in a small rabbit fur cloak against the pre-dawn chill, stayed close to the warmth, his eyes wide as he watched the familiar world of their summer camp being methodically erased, packed away for the journey ahead. The sweet scent of the pawpaw grove was still in the air, but but it was thinner now, muted by the cold. When everything was ready, the father shouldered his pack, took up a sturdy walking staff of ironwood, and led them away from the riverbank, turning his face to the north. Their footsteps were the only sound, the soft padding of their deerskin moccasins a gentle rhythm on the packed earth of the trail. The path they followed was not a road that had been cut through the wilderness. It was a story written on the land itself, a thin, winding line that had been traced by the feet of their ancestors for more generations than could be counted. It was a path of memory. It clung to the eastern bank of the wide, slow-moving river, sometimes rising onto a low ridge to avoid a marshy patch, other times dipping down to follow the gentle curve of a sandy shore. It was a path that knew the easiest way to cross a small, babbling creek on a series of time-worn stepping stones, and it knew the exact spot to pass through a thicket of spicebush without disturbing its fragrant branches too much. Walking this path was an act of communion with those who had come before. Every smooth, hard-packed section spoke of the passage of countless feet. Every stone worn slick was a testament to its age. As the first hint of gray began to soften the eastern sky, the details of the world around them began to emerge from the darkness. A thick, white mist rose from the surface of the river, swirling in slow, ghostly currents, making the far bank seem like a distant, undiscovered country. The leaves of the jewelweed that grew in damp, shady patches along the trail were beaded with 1,000 tiny droplets of dew, each one a perfect, shimmering jewel in the faint light. The father walked with a steady, ground-covering pace, his eyes not fixed on the distance but constantly scanning the world immediately around him. He was not just walking, he was reading. The trail and its surroundings were a living book, full of information for those who knew the language. He pointed out a set of tracks in a patch of soft mud near a spring. "A fox," he murmured to his son, who walked close behind him. "He came for a drink just before we did. See how his prints are neat and in a straight line? He is a purposeful hunter." A little further on, he paused and touched the bark of a shagbark hickory, its long peeling strips looking like woody ribbons. "When we come back this way, the nuts will be falling," he said. "The squirrels will be busy then, and we will gather what they leave for us." These were not formal lessons. They were a continuous conversation with the environment, a way of weaving his son's awareness into the fabric of the living world. The boy, in turn, was learning to see with more than just his eyes. He was learning to feel the subtle changes in the trail under his feet, from soft loam to hard clay to loose gravel. He was learning to listen, to distinguish the sharp, cheerful call of a cardinal from the scolding chatter of a wren in the undergrowth. He was learning the names of the trees not from pictures, but from the feel of their bark, the shape of their leaves, the way they held their branches to the sky. The mother walked with a different kind of awareness. Her gaze was drawn to the plants that bordered the path. She saw not just a tangle of green, but a world of purpose. She noted a thick stand of stinging nettle, its season for eating now past, but its tough stalks a future source of strong cordage. Her eyes followed the twining vines of a wild grapevine up the trunk of a box elder, making a mental map of where the ripest bunches would be found. She saw a patch of yarrow, its white, flat-topped flowers now browning and going to seed, and gave a silent thanks for the medicine it had provided. Her knowledge was practical and deep, a living encyclopedia of use and remedy. The forest was her larder and her medicine chest, and she moved through it with the quiet confidence of a master in her workshop. In the middle of their small procession walked the grandmother. Her pace was the slowest, the most deliberate. She did not need to scan the trail for immediate signs or opportunities. Her knowledge was of a deeper, more cyclical kind. She looked at the larger patterns. She noted the color of the moss on the north-facing trunks of the oaks, the height of the river against its banks, the particular way the light filtered through the canopy. She was reading the long story of the season, a story she had read many times before. She walked in a sphere of respectful silence, her presence a calming anchor for the entire family. At one point, the trail widened as it passed through a small, sun-dappled clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a single, immense sycamore tree, It was ancient, a true grandfather of the forest. Its trunk was massive, a mottled patchwork of white, gray, and pale green where the older bark had peeled away. Its lowest branches were as thick as the trunks of lesser trees, and they reached out in every direction, creating a vast, living canopy. This was a sacred place. The air here felt different, quieter, holding a sense of deep time and patient witness. As they approached the tree, their quiet conversations ceased. They slowed their steps, their movements becoming even more reverent. This tree had stood here when the grandmother's own grandmother was a small child. It had provided shade for their ancestors. It had seen the seasons turn hundreds of times. It had witnessed births and deaths, joys and sorrows. It was a connection to their past, a living monument. The grandmother paused at the base of the massive trunk and reached into a small leather pouch she wore around her neck. She took out a tiny pinch of dried tobacco, a sacred plant, and offered it into a small crevice in the bark. She murmured a few words, too quiet for the others to hear, a prayer of thanks, of respect, of asking for a safe passage. The others stood in respectful silence, their heads bowed slightly, until she was finished. Then, they continued on their way, leaving the ancient tree to its silent vigil, their spirits calmed and centered by this small, profound ritual. As the sun climbed higher, it burned away the last of the river mist, and the day settled into a clear, crisp beauty. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the air had a clean, sharp edge to it, a constant reminder of the reason for their journey. They walked on, their rhythm steady, their progress marked by the changing features of the river beside them. They passed a place where a tall shale cliff dropped straight down to the water, a place where swallows had built their mud nests. They walked through a low, marshy area on a causeway of carefully placed stones that had been laid by their ancestors. Their goal was not a single destination, but a series of known places, a rosary of gathering spots strung along the thread of the river path. There was the grove of black cherry trees that grew on the south-facing slope of the next hill, the thicket of elderberries in the damp soil where a small tributary joined the main river, and beyond that, the stand of persimmon trees that was their ultimate, most important destination. Each of these places existed as a clear, vivid image in their minds, a map built not of paper and ink, but of memory and story. By late afternoon, when the shadows had begun to lengthen once again, the father began to look for a place to make their first camp. He chose a spot on a small, flat terrace of land set back from the river, protected from the persistent north wind by a dense stand of eastern hemlock trees. A tiny, clear spring trickled out from a moss-covered rock face nearby, promising fresh, cold water. The ground was covered in a soft bed of fallen pine needles. It was a good place, a place that offered shelter and comfort. Without a need for commands, the work of making camp began. The father, using his stone axe, carefully trimmed a few dead, fallen branches from the surrounding trees, never cutting from a living thing for a temporary shelter. He leaned these against a low-hanging hemlock branch, creating the simple, sturdy framework for a lean-to. The boy helped, gathering smaller branches and armfuls of soft hemlock boughs, which his mother then wove into the framework, creating a thick, fragrant, and surprisingly well-insulated wall against the wind. The interior was then filled with a deep, springy mattress of more boughs, a bed that would not only provide comfort but also keep the cold of the ground from seeping into their bodies as they slept. While the shelter was being built, the grandmother took on the sacred and essential task of making fire. She knelt on the ground and cleared a small circle of earth down to the bare soil. From her pack, she took out her fire kit, a curved bough, a straight spindle of yucca stalk, a fireboard of dry basswood with a small charred notch already carved into it, and a clamshell holding a fine, fluffy ball of cattail down. She placed the tip of the spindle into the notch, looped the bowstring around it, and began to draw the bow back and forth with a steady, rhythmic motion. The spindle whirled, its friction against the fireboard creating a thin curl of smoke and a growing pile of hot, dark dust. She increased her speed, her motions a blur of controlled energy, until the dust began to glow with a tiny red coal. Working quickly but with no sign of haste, she gently tipped this precious coal into the clamshell with the tinder and blew on it with a long, soft, steady breath. The tinder began to smoke, then glowed brighter, and with a final, gentle puff, it burst into a tiny, bright flame. She carefully transferred this infant flame to a small nest of shredded cedar bark and dry grass, nurturing it, feeding it tiny twigs until it was strong enough to consume larger pieces of wood. Soon, a proper fire was crackling in the stone-lined pit they had made, its light pushing back the gathering twilight, its warmth a welcome blessing against the evening's chill. The first fire of their journey was kindled, a circle of life and security in the vast, darkening wilderness. As the first stars began to appear in the sky, as sharp and cold as the night before, the family gathered around the flames, a tiny island of warmth, their hearts filled with the quiet satisfaction of a day of good, purposeful travel. The journey had begun. After 2 more days of steady, unhurried travel along the winding river path, the landscape began to change once again. The thick, mixed woodlands of oak, hickory, and maple started to thin, giving way to more open country. The trail led them away from the immediate riverbank, up a gentle, sun-drenched slope that was covered in tall, dry grasses, which swayed in the cool north wind, making a sound like a slow, deep exhalation. The soil here was sandier, the air felt drier, and the trees that grew were of a different character. They were sparser, tougher, and stood with a certain stubborn resilience. It was here, on this south-facing hill where the sun could pour its warmth down all day long, that they found what they were looking for. It was a stand of persimmon trees, perhaps 24 of them, scattered across the hillside like a group of old, stoic friends. They were not majestic trees like the great sycamore or the mighty oak. They were slender and unassuming, with a distinctive bark that was dark gray and broken into a pattern of thick, square blocks, looking almost like the hide of an alligator. And on their wiry, angular branches, hanging like small, festive ornaments, were the persimmons. From a distance, the fruit looked beautiful, a bounty ready for the taking. Each one was a small, round globe, about the size of a wild plum, and their color was a vibrant, burnished orange against the deep green of the waxy leaves. The branches were heavy with them, bending slightly under the weight of the promised harvest. The boy's eyes lit up at the sight. After days of walking, this felt like a great prize. The pawpaws had been a soft, creamy treat, but their season was fleeting, and they did not store well. The persimmon was different. When properly dried, its sweetness would last deep into the winter, a concentrated taste of sunshine to be enjoyed by the fire on the coldest, darkest nights. Eager and forgetting for a moment the lessons of the pawpaw grove, he broke away from his mother's side and ran ahead, his small feet kicking up puffs of dusty soil as he made his way to the nearest tree. He found a low-hanging branch, heavy with fruit, and reached up on his tiptoes, his fingers stretching for the most perfect, brightly colored persimmon he could see. He could already imagine its rich, pudding-like sweetness in his mouth. Just as his fingers were about to close around the fruit's smooth skin, the grandmother's voice came from behind him, not sharp or scolding, but as calm and steady as the hill itself. "Stop, little one, it is not time." He paused, his hand hovering in the air, a look of confusion on his face. The fruit looked perfect. The sun had colored it a beautiful orange. The branches were full. Why would it not be time? The grandmother walked slowly up the slope to join him, her moccasins making no sound on the dry earth. She did not look at him, but at the tree itself, with a knowing, respectful gaze. "This tree has a great gift to give," she said softly, placing a hand on the boy's small shoulder. "But it does not give it easily. The persimmon has a lesson to teach us before it will share its sweetness. It is the lesson of patience." She reached up to the very branch he had been aiming for and, with a gentle twist, plucked the perfect-looking orange fruit. She held it in the palm of her hand for him to see. It was flawless, a small orb of autumn color, "It looks ready," she acknowledged, seeing the question in his eyes. "It dresses itself in the color of ripeness, but its heart is not yet kind." She took a small, sharp flint knife from a pouch at her belt and carefully sliced the persimmon in half. The flesh inside was a deep, inviting orange, and a few dark, flat seeds were embedded in the pulp. It looked delicious. She handed one half to the boy. "Taste it," she urged gently. Trusting her, he put the small slice into his mouth. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. His face contorted, his eyes squeezed shut, and his mouth puckered as if he had just tasted raw, bitter bark. He spat the fruit out onto the ground, a wave of revulsion passing over him. The taste was not sweet. It was powerfully astringent, a chalky, mouth-drying bitterness that seemed to suck all the moisture from his tongue and cheeks. It was an aggressive, unpleasant sensation that clung to his palate, a taste of profound unreadiness. The grandmother watched him, her expression one of gentle understanding. She took a small water skin from her belt and gave it to him so he could rinse the offending taste from his mouth. "Now you know the persimmon's secret," she said, her voice still soft. "Its beauty is a trick for now. It holds its sweetness deep inside, guarded by a bitter spirit." This was the central, crucial lesson of this particular fruit, a piece of knowledge that stood between a bountiful harvest and a wasted journey. The vibrant orange color was a lie. The true signal of ripeness for the persimmon was not visual. It was an event. This bitterness, the narrator's voice would calmly explain, as if sitting right there with them, is caused by a high concentration of compounds called tannins. They are the tree's way of protecting the fruit while its seeds are still developing, making it inedible to animals who might otherwise eat it too early and fail to spread the seeds. The sweetness is there, in the form of complex starches, but it is locked away, hidden behind this powerful chemical defense. The grandmother continued her lesson in the simpler, more poetic language of her people. The persimmon is waiting for a special visitor. It is waiting for the first hard frost. The touch of the cold is a signal. It tells the fruit that the season is ending, that it is time to let go of its bitterness. The cold works a magic on the fruit. It turns the sourness into sugar, and it softens the flesh. Only then is the persimmon ready to share its true gift. She looked from the half-eaten fruit on the ground to the sky, that clear, sharp blue that still carried the memory of the northern wind. "We have come here to meet the frost. We will make our camp and we will wait with the trees. The fruit teaches patience, and so we must be patient students." And so, their life became one of active waiting. They were not idle. To be idle in the wilderness was to be wasteful, to ignore the opportunities the land was always offering. Their waiting was simply a new kind of work, a period of sustained, observant living in this one place. They established a more settled camp than the simple lean-to of their journey. The father found a sheltered spot in a small hollow at the base of the hill, protected by a cluster of junipers from the ever-present north wind. He built a more substantial shelter, a small domed structure made from flexible maple saplings. He bent over and tied together at the top with strips of hickory bark. This frame was then covered with layers of woven cattail mats they had carried with them, creating a snug, weatherproof dwelling that could keep them warm and dry for many days, if need be. A central fire pit was dug, and a drying rack of green wood was constructed nearby, ready for the eventual harvest. This was their home now, for as long as the persimmons required them to stay. The days settled into a new rhythm, a rhythm dictated not by travel, but by the tasks of sustenance and the slow passage of time. Each morning, the father would take his mended net and his fishing spears and walk the short distance back to the river. He would spend hours in silent concentration, wading in the cool shallows, his eyes reading the subtle currents and ripples on the water's surface. He knew where the bass liked to hide in the shadow of a sunken log, and he knew where the schools of sunfish gathered in the sun-warmed pools. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost invisible. When he speared a fish, it was with a single, swift motion, a flicker of his arm so fast it barely seemed to disturb the water. He would return to the camp in the middle of the day with 3 or 4 good-sized fish, which the mother would clean by the stream, her flint knife moving with practiced skill. She would fillet them and set them to cook over the coals, or smoke them on the new rack for a future meal. In the afternoons, while the father repaired a tool or sharpened a stone point, the mother would take the boy and walk the edges of the woods. She was teaching him the patient art of the snare. She showed him how to find the almost invisible trails that rabbits used as they moved through the thick brush. She showed him how to tie a slip knot in a piece of sinew that was so sensitive it would be triggered by the slightest touch. And she showed him the most important lesson, how to place the snare so it was a natural part of the landscape, looping it through a small archway in the grass, its presence completely disguised. They were not just setting traps, they were learning to think like the rabbit, to anticipate its movements, to understand its world. The grandmother, in her quiet way, contributed her own steady stream of provisions to their small camp. She did not hunt or fish, but her eyes saw things the others missed. She taught the boy to dig for the starchy, nutritious roots of the cattails that grew in a marshy patch near the river. She showed him how to identify the deep green, saw-toothed leaves of the dandelion, whose bitterness was a welcome, cleansing counterpoint to the richness of the fish and meat. And she gathered late-season berries from the spice bush, small red ovals of fruit that, when dried and crushed, would provide a warm, allspice-like flavor for their winter stews. Their life in this waiting place was a tapestry of these small, meaningful tasks. It was a life of complete self-sufficiency, every meal a direct result of their own skill, knowledge, and effort. The days were full, but never hurried, and always, in the background, were the persimmon trees. Twice a day, in the morning and in the evening, the grandmother would walk up the hill with the boy and they would stand among the trees. They would look at the fruit, still hard, still bright orange. The grandmother would gently touch a branch, as if to reassure the tree they were still there, still waiting. These small pilgrimages were a constant, physical reminder of their purpose. They were not just surviving, they were waiting for a kind of miracle, for the alchemical touch of the cold that would transform bitter into sweet. The sun would set, the stars would come out, still sharp, still cold, and the family would gather by the fire, their bellies full, their minds at peace. They were living the lesson the fruit was teaching. This was the patient art of the persimmon, an art that required not just skill of hand, but quietness of spirit, and a deep, unshakable trust in the cycles of the world. The days of waiting by the persimmon grove unfolded with a quiet rhythm all their own. A pattern emerged, as natural and unforced as the rising and setting of the Sunday. The crisp, cool mornings were for the hunt, for checking the snares set in the rabbit runs, and for fishing in the clear, cold shallows of the river. The afternoons, when the sun was at its highest and warmest, were for the patient, focused work of the hands. It was during one of these long, sunlit afternoons, while the father was sharpening a set of bonefish hooks, and the boy was practicing his knots on a piece of spare cordage, that the mother turned her attention to a different kind of provision. She reached into their shelter and brought out a large gathering basket, a vessel that was as much a part of their family life as the fire pit or the clay cooking pot. It was a beautiful thing, woven from wide splints of wood, its shape a graceful, functional bowl, its sides darkened and worn smooth from the friction of countless harvests. It had carried heavy loads of hickory nuts, held delicate mushrooms, been filled to the brim with wild onions and sweet roots. The basket was a silent historian of their sustenance, its scuffs and stains, a map of their seasons of abundance. But it was also weary. A season of carrying sharp-edged river mussels had left a long abrasive scar near the rim, weakening the weave. And near the bottom, where the weight of its burdens always settled, 2 of the main splints had cracked and begun to unravel, creating a small, gaping hole. It was still usable for large things, but tiny seeds or late-season blueberries would now be lost through the gap. To an outsider, the basket might have seemed ready to be discarded, its useful life over. But for the mother, this was not a problem to be solved by replacement. but an opportunity for renewal. Mending was not a chore. It was an act of respect for the tool, for the tree that had given its body to create it, and for the work it had yet to do. The tools of their life were not disposable. They were partners, companions in the work of survival, and they were cared for with a deep and abiding reverence. She ran her fingers over the frayed edges of the hole, her touch diagnostic, understanding the nature of the break. The basket needed more than a simple patch. It needed new life to be woven into its very structure, a strengthening that would make it whole and trustworthy again. The first step in this process of renewal was a journey. The materials for the repair would not come from a storeroom, but from the living forest. She knew exactly what she needed. Not just any wood would do. The basket was made from the wood of the black ash, a tree that held a special relationship with her people. It was a tree that grew in damp, low-lying places, often near the river's edge, and it possessed a unique quality that made it the perfect choice for basketry. She spoke quietly to the father, and together they left the small camp, walking not along the main river path, but delving deeper into the woods, heading toward a swampy hollow they had noted on their journey. The boy followed, his feet silent on the damp earth, his senses open and eager to learn. The mother led the way, her eyes scanning the forest floor and the trunks of the trees. She was looking for a very specific individual, not an ancient grandfather tree, but a young sapling, straight and tall, about the thickness of a man's forearm, and free of low-hanging branches that would create knots in the wood. She pointed one out, its bark smooth and gray, its leaves just beginning to show the first hint of autumn yellow. The father approached the chosen tree with respect. He did not simply start cutting. He placed a hand on its smooth bark and stood for a moment in silence, a quiet acknowledgement of the life he was about to take for the sake of his own. It was a transaction rooted in necessity and gratitude, not in conquest. Then, with his heavy stone axe, he began to work. The sound was not the sharp, ringing crack of a modern steel axe, but a series of dull, percussive thuds. He did not chop at the tree, but rather bruised and crushed the fibers in a deep, V-shaped notch, working his way around the trunk. It was slower, more laborious work, requiring patience and a deep understanding of how wood behaves. The boy watched, mesmerized, as the chips of wood, more shredded than cut, fell to the forest floor. Finally, with a soft, tearing groan, the young tree yielded and fell gracefully into a clearing. The father then carefully cut a long, straight section from the trunk, about the length of a man's height, and together they carried the heavy green log back to their camp. This single log was not just a piece of wood, it was a bundle of latent potential, a promise of strength and utility waiting to be unlocked by skill and knowledge. Back at the camp, the next stage of the process began, a transformation that seemed almost magical. The father laid the ash log on two smaller support logs to keep it off the ground. He then took a heavy wooden billet, a short, club-like piece of ironwood, and began to pound the ash log with a steady, rhythmic series of heavy blows. Thud, 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 thud. The sound echoed through the quiet afternoon, a slow, deliberate heartbeat. He worked his way down the entire length of the log, his strikes even and controlled. He was not trying to break the wood, but to shock it. The unique magic of the black ash is in its growth rings. Unlike other trees, the porous layer of its early spring growth is weak. The force of the pounding crushes this weak layer, separating the harder, more fibrous late-season growth rings from one another. In essence, he was asking the tree to delaminate itself, to offer up its layers as ready-made splints. After pounding the entire length of the log, the mother took over. She used a sturdy wooden wedge to pry up the end of the outermost growth ring. It lifted easily, and with a soft, hissing, tearing sound, she began to peel a long, continuous ribbon of wood away from the log. It was a splint, perhaps 1/8 of an inch thick and 2 inches wide, the length of the entire log. She peeled another, and then another, the tree seeming to unwind itself under her knowing hands. It was an act of incredible intimacy with the material, a process born from centuries of observation and passed down wisdom. They worked until they had a thick bundle of these rough splints, the pale, fragrant wood smelling of the deep, damp forest. These newly freed splints, however, were still too thick and stiff for weaving. The mother sat with the bundle in her lap and, using her sharp flint knife, she carefully split each one, separating the rough, inner side from the smooth, outer side. She then continued to split them further, her knife guided by the grain of the wood, until she had a large pile of thin, flexible, yet incredibly strong strips. But even now, they were not ready. Though thin, the fresh splints were brittle. If she tried to bend them into the tight curves needed for the basket, they would snap. They needed to be made pliable, to be coaxed into a state of willing flexibility. She gathered the refined splints into a loose bundle and carried them down to the river's edge. She found a calm, shallow pool where the water moved with a gentle, lazy current over a bed of smooth gray stones. She waded into the cold, clear water up to her knees and laid the bundle of splints on the bottom of the pool, placing a large, heavy river stone on top to hold them submerged. There they would soak, the cool water seeping deep into their fibers, relaxing their rigidity, making them soft and cooperative. It was another form of waiting, a microcosm of the larger waiting they were doing for the persimmons. It was a reminder that force was not the answer. The right conditions, combined with time, would always yield the best results. An hour later, as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the western hills, she returned to the river. She retrieved the splints, which now felt different in her hands. They were heavier, cooler, and when she bent one, it curved gracefully, without a hint of resistance. They were ready. She carried the dripping bundle back to the warmth of the fire and sat down on a soft deer hide, arranging her materials around her. This was where the true art began. Her hands, which a few hours ago were strong enough to strip wood from a log, now became instruments of delicate precision. She first examined the hole in the basket, using her flint knife to trim the broken ends of the old splints, creating a clean, stable foundation for the repair. Then, she took several of the new, soaked splints and began to weave them directly into the existing structure of the basket. Her fingers moved with a quiet, hypnotic rhythm that the boy watched with silent fascination. Over, under, over, under. She wove new vertical splints, the standards, into the base of the basket, their ends tucked securely into the undamaged weave below the hole. Then she began to weave the horizontal strips, the weavers, through them, pulling each one taut, her thumb pressing the new layer firmly against the one before it. The soft, rhythmic friction of the wet splints sliding against each other was the only sound, a gentle, creative whisper. As she worked, she spoke quietly to her son, her voice as much a part of the rhythm as the movement of her hands. "This is a basket for heavy things," she explained, holding it up so he could see the wide, flat splints, like the persimmons we will gather soon, or the nuts from the hickory tree. The weave is strong, but the gaps are wide, so if we gather roots from the riverbank, we can dip the whole basket in the water and wash the mud away before we even come back to camp. She then pointed to a much smaller, more delicate basket that sat inside their shelter. "That one," she said, "is woven from the inner bark of the willow. The strands are thin and we weave them very tightly together. There are no gaps. That is a basket for the tiny seeds of the amaranth, or for the wild rice we gather in the marshes. If we used this basket," she gestured to the one in her hands, "we would lose them all before we took 10 steps." In this quiet, simple way, she was teaching him not just the how of a skill, but the why. She was instilling in him the understanding that every tool must be perfectly suited to its purpose, and that this knowledge was the key to a life without waste, a life of elegant efficiency. The hole in the large basket slowly disappeared, replaced by a neat, tightly woven patch of new, pale wood that stood out against the older, darker material. It was a scar, but a scar of healing, a mark of renewal that made the basket stronger than it had been before. When the last splint was woven in and the end tucked away, she held it up, turning it in the firelight. It was whole again, ready. The quiet, meditative work was finished, a small circle of completion within the larger circle of their waiting. The repaired basket sat beside the fire, its new wood slowly drying in the warmth, a silent, beautiful testament to a family that could not only read the messages on the wind, but could also, with their own skilled hands, mend the tools of their own survival. The frost arrived not with a roar, but with a profound and sudden silence. One evening, as the sun went down, the persistent north wind that had been their companion for days finally died away completely. The air grew still, and with that stillness came a new and deeper cold, a cold that felt as if it were seeping up from the earth itself rather than blowing across it. The sky, which had been a brilliant blue, deepened into an indigo of extraordinary clarity. There was no moon. As darkness settled over their camp, the stars emerged not as gentle points of light, but as fierce, silent fires burning in the immense blackness, their brilliance undiminished by even a whisper of atmospheric haze. The grandmother, standing just outside the warm circle of their firelight, looked up into the fathomless night and gave a single, slow nod. The messenger wind had done its work. The visitor it had announced was now at the door. Inside their small, snug lodge, a different kind of warmth enveloped them. A warmth not just of fire, but of contented bodies, of shared breath. They slept soundly, wrapped in their soft hides, insulated from the earth by their bed of fragrant hemlock boughs. Outside, in the absolute quiet of the frozen world, the magic was happening. When the first pale light of dawn crept over the eastern hills, the world they awoke to had been utterly transformed. They emerged from their shelter into a landscape painted in a single, breathtaking color: silver. Every blade of dry grass, every curled leaf on the forest floor, every delicate, spun silk thread of a spider's web was outlined in a delicate, crystalline lacework of white frost. The air was sharp and clean, so cold it felt bracing to breathe, a clean feeling in the back of the throat. The silence was absolute. No birds sang, no insects chirped. It was as if the world was holding its breath in awe of its own frozen beauty. The boy stood motionless, his own warm breath pluming in front of him like a small white cloud. He reached out a small finger and touched a frost-covered leaf, marveling at the intricate patterns, the tiny, perfect needles of ice. This was the visitor. This was the hard frost. And it was more beautiful and more peaceful than he could ever have imagined. There was no sense of hurry, no panicked rush to the trees. The family took their time, sharing a simple breakfast of smoked fish and dried berries by the fire, letting the sun climb a little higher in the sky. They trusted the process. The frost had done its work in the darkness, and now they would simply go to see the results. When the time felt right, the grandmother led them up the hill to the persimmon grove. As they walked, a new sound began to fill the quiet air, the soft crunch of their moccasins on the frozen grass. When they reached the trees, they saw that the frost had worked its promised transformation. The fruits were no longer a bright, hard orange. Their color had deepened to a rich, dusky purple red, and their skins, once tight and waxy, were now wrinkled and soft, dusted with a fine, sugary-looking bloom of ice crystals. They no longer hung from the branches with a stubborn firmness, but drooped slightly, as if relaxed, heavy with a newfound sweetness. The bitter spirit was gone, banished by the cold. The key had turned in the lock. The grandmother reached up to a low-hanging branch, her fingers gently closing around one of the soft, wrinkled fruits. It came away from its stem with the slightest pull, a sign of perfect ripeness. She held it for a moment, then gave it to the boy. "Now," she said, her voice soft in the still air. "Now it is ready." He looked at the fruit in his hand. It was unrecognizable from the hard, bitter thing he had tasted days ago. Tentatively, he took a small bite. A look of pure, unadulterated delight spread across his face. The flesh was no longer firm, but soft and yielding, a thick, sweet pudding with a complex, honeyed flavor that was part apricot, part date, with a hint of wild spice. It was a taste of pure, concentrated autumn sunshine, a sweetness made all the more profound by the patient waiting and the memory of the bitterness it had replaced. The harvest was a joyful and deliberate affair. The father, being the tallest, gently shook the higher branches, and the ripe persimmons rained down onto the soft, deer-hide blankets the mother had spread on the ground below, their soft landing ensuring they did not burst. The mother and grandmother, using their baskets, including the newly mended one, which now performed its duty flawlessly, gathered the fallen fruit. The boy, careful not to crush them, added his own small handfuls to the growing pile. They worked with a quiet, efficient harmony, their movements flowing together, a small family unit moving as one. They were careful to leave some fruit on every tree, a share for the deer, the opossums, and the other animals who also relied on the persimmon's gift. It was a harvest of gratitude, not of greed. By midday, their baskets were full, heavy with the sweet, dark fruit that promised warmth and nourishment through the coming winter. The harvest of patience was complete, and it was sweeter than they could have hoped. Their journey, however, was not over. The frost that had blessed the persimmons was a signal that their time of open, easy gathering was drawing to a close. With the promise of the persimmons secured, they broke camp and continued their journey northward along the river, their steps now lighter, buoyed by their success. Their next destination was a different kind of place, a marshy wetland where a slow-moving creek fed into the main river. Here, the ground was soft and spongy underfoot, and the air was filled with the damp, earthy smell of cattails and sedges. This was the home of the elderberry. They found the bushes growing in dense, tangled thickets, their arching canes heavy with clusters of tiny, deep purple berries. The berries were so dark they were almost black, and they grew in large, flat-topped bunches that hung downward like heavy, beaded necklaces. The grandmother approached the elderberry with a particular kind of reverence. For her, and for her people, this plant was not just a source of food, it was a powerful ally, a guardian against the hardships of the coming season. She explained its dual nature to her grandson as they worked. "You see these berries?" she said, her fingers gently brushing against a heavy cluster. "They are small, but they hold a great strength. When we cook them down into a thick syrup, they become a powerful medicine. A spoonful of this medicine each morning during the cold moons will keep the sickness of winter from entering our lodge. It keeps our bodies strong and our spirits bright." She showed him how to harvest the berries, not by picking them one by one, but by carefully snipping the entire cluster, or umbel, at its base with her flint knife, letting the whole heavy bunch fall gently into her basket. This was more efficient and also protected the tiny, delicate berries from being crushed. As the mother and grandmother gathered the fruit, the father moved through the thicket with a different purpose. He was not looking at the berries, but at the canes themselves. He selected several straight, thick, second-year canes and, after offering a pinch of tobacco in thanks, he cut them near their base. He explained to the boy that the elderberry cane has a soft, pithy core that can be easily pushed out, leaving behind a strong, hollow tube of wood. "These," he said, holding up one of the long, smooth canes, "will become many things for us. From the thinnest sections, we will make taps to gather the sweet sap of the maple tree when the winter begins to break. From the thicker parts, your mother will make spindles for her weaving, and I," he said with a small smile, "will make you a small flute so you can play the songs of the birds." The boy's eyes widened with excitement. In this single plant they found food, medicine, tools, and even music. It was a perfect example of their holistic understanding of the world, where every living thing was seen not for a single use, but for the totality of its gifts. They were not just harvesting a resource, they were interacting with a multifaceted provider, a relative in the great family of the living world. With their baskets now holding the dark, glossy jewels of the elderberries alongside the soft, sweet persimmons, they moved on once more. Their packs were growing heavier, but their spirits were high. They had met the challenge of the frost and had been rewarded. They had gathered the gifts of the elderberry, securing not just sweetness but health for the coming winter. The land was providing for them, and they, in turn, were moving through it with gratitude and skill. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the marsh, they made their camp. The fire was lit, and the rich, fruity smell of elderberries simmering in a clay pot soon filled the air, a fragrant promise of the medicine they were making. The father sat by the fire, already beginning the careful work of hollowing out one of the elderberry canes with a long, thin rod. The journey was not just a quest for food, but a continuous process of creation and transformation, turning the raw gifts of the land into the very tools and sustenance of their lives. Each step, each harvest, each skilled act of making was a verse in the long, quiet poem of their survival. The next stage of their journey took them away from the flat, damp lowlands of the river and into the rolling hills that rose to the east. The air grew cooler and thinner as they climbed, and the forest changed its character once again. The sycamores and willows of the riverbank were replaced by the deeper, more ancient woods of maple, beech, and tulip poplar. Their goal now was a specific place, a landmark in the mental geography that guided their travels. It was a sheltered hollow, a shallow, bowl-like depression tucked between two high, stony ridges, a place known to their family for generations as a reliable source of high-bush cranberries. These were not the sweet, jam-like cranberries of a modern table, but a hardier, wilder fruit. They were tart and astringent, but when cooked down with sweeter fruits like persimmons, they provided a bright, acidic counterpoint and were incredibly rich in the vital nutrients that would help ward off sickness during the long, monotonous diet of winter. The memory of this place was a promise of a final, essential component for their winter stores. They had the sweetness of the pawpaw and persimmon, the medicine of the elderberry. Now they sought the sour, the sharp, the balancing element. As they crested the final ridge and began their descent into the familiar hollow, an uncharacteristic silence greeted them. On previous visits, this place had been alive with the chatter of birds and the rustling of small animals, all drawn to the promise of the bright red berries. Today, the air was still and quiet. A feeling of something amiss, a subtle disharmony in the natural order of the place, settled over them. The father, walking in the lead, slowed his pace, his senses on high alert. He motioned for his family to be quiet, though they already were, their own instincts having picked up on the same silent cues. They entered the hollow, their footsteps muffled by a thick carpet of fallen maple leaves, their colors a brilliant tapestry of red, gold, and orange, and then they saw it. The cranberry bushes, which should have been heavy laden with clusters of bright, jewel-like red berries, were stripped bare. The branches were naked, their leaves already beginning to wither. A few lonely, crushed berries lay on the ground, a sad testament to the feast that had already taken place. The boy felt a pang of disappointment. His mind had been set on the tangy taste of the berries, on the familiar task of gathering them. It felt like a theft, a promise broken, but there was no anger or disappointment in the father's face, nor in the grandmother's. There was only a quiet, focused observation. The father knelt down, his eyes scanning the soft earth at the base of the largest bush. The story of what had happened here was written clearly in the soil for anyone who knew how to read the language of the woods. There, pressed into the damp leaf mold, were the unmistakable tracks of a black bear. They were huge, the hind print looking almost like a giant, flattened human footprint, the front print wider, with the deep, clear impressions of 5 long, non-retractable claws digging into the earth. There were other signs, too. A nearby sapling was scarred, its bark shredded where the bear had likely stood on its hind legs and raked its claws to mark its territory. A large, overturned rock showed where it had been grubbing for insects, and everywhere there were broken branches on the cranberry bushes, evidence of the bear's impatient, brute force method of harvesting. The father pointed to the tracks, showing his son how to read them. "Look," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You can see how the back foot is placed, the weight on the outside edge. This was a large bear, a male, and see the direction of the prints? He was heading north, up and over the ridge. He is long gone from here now." The boy looked at the huge tracks with a mixture of fear and awe. A bear was a powerful, respected, and potentially dangerous creature. But the father's tone held no fear, only a kind of clinical respect. "He came for the same reason we did," the father continued. "He is preparing for his own long winter sleep. He needs the fruit to build up the fat that will sustain him through the cold moons. We are not rivals. We are fellow harvesters." This was a profound and crucial lesson. The disappointment the boy had felt was a human emotion, born of expectation. The bear, in its simple, direct way, had simply followed its own needs, its own ancient rhythms. The forest did not belong to the family. They were simply one part of its complex web of life, and sometimes another part of that web had a more pressing claim. To be angry at the bear would be as nonsensical as being angry at the river for flowing or at the sun for setting. The challenge now was not one of conflict, but of adaptation. The expected resource was gone. This setback was not a disaster. It was a test of their deeper knowledge, of their resilience. They stood in the quiet, empty hollow for a long moment, the father and mother looking at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. Their mental map of the area, the one they had always relied upon, had just proven to be a dead end. Now, they had to access a different kind of map, one stored not in landmarks, but in memory and story. The grandmother, who had been standing silently, her eyes closed as if listening to the hollow itself, finally spoke. Her voice was calm, a steadying presence in the face of the unexpected. "I remember a story," she began, "that my own grandmother told me when I was a little girl, no bigger than you." She looked at the boy, her eyes kindling with the light of a distant memory. "She told me of a time, during a dry season, when these bushes here gave no fruit. The people were worried, but her mother knew another place, a secret place." She paused, gathering the threads of the old story in her mind. The story said you must follow the morning sun from this very hollow up to the top of the eastern ridge, and on that ridge, you must look for a rock formation that looks like a great turtle sleeping on the mountainside. "Behind the turtle's shell," she said, "down in a cool, damp place where a spring comes out of the rock, there is another patch of these berries, a smaller patch, one that is easy to miss if you do not know the story." It was a long shot, a map made of words and images passed down through 3 generations. It was a piece of knowledge that had lain dormant, unused, for decades. In a world of written words and drawn maps, such a story might be dismissed as folklore, an unreliable guide at best. But for these people, oral tradition was a library of practical, life-saving information. The stories were not just entertainment, they were encyclopedias, atlases, and survival manuals, their details polished and perfected over countless retellings, ensuring that only the essential, verifiable information survived. The father looked at the grandmother and nodded. He had heard the story as a child, but had forgotten it, his own experience having always led him here, to this reliable hollow. Now, in the face of this setback, the old story rose from the depths of his memory, offering a new path, a new hope. The challenge had become a lesson in the power of memory, in the wisdom of listening to the elders, in trusting the knowledge that had been carefully curated and handed down by the ancestors. Their journey now had a new, more mysterious objective. They were no longer simply following a path. They were following a story, chasing the echo of an ancestor's voice across the landscape. They left the bare-stripped hollow and began the climb up the eastern ridge, the sun warm on their backs. The ascent was steep, and they moved slowly, their breath coming in steady plumes in the cool, thin air. When they reached the windswept summit of the ridge, they paused, their eyes scanning the rocky outcrops that dotted the crest. And there it was. It was unmistakable. A massive, rounded outcrop of granite, long and low to the ground, with a smaller, block-like section of rock at one end that looked for all the world like a turtle's head. It was larger and more obvious than the story had even suggested. A thrill of recognition, of connection to the past, ran through them. The grandmother's grandmother had stood on this very spot, had looked at this very rock, and her knowledge was now guiding them, a thread of continuity stretching across the vast expanse of time. Following the instructions of the story, they made their way around to the north side of the great stone turtle, into its cool shadow. The air here was damp, and the ground was covered in a thick, green carpet of moss. And just as the story had promised, a tiny, clear spring of water trickled out from a fissure at the base of the rock, creating a small, wet patch of ground before disappearing into the earth again. And there, clustered around the life-giving dampness of the hidden spring, was a small, thriving thicket of high bush cranberries, their branches heavy with clusters of brilliant, untouched red berries. It was not a large patch, perhaps only a quarter of the size of the one in the hollow below, but it was enough. It was more than enough. The story was true. The ancestors had provided. The setback had not been a dead end, but a detour that had led them to a deeper and more profound connection with their own history. As they began the final, grateful harvest of their long journey, they were not just gathering fruit, they were gathering proof that the old ways, the old stories, held a power that could still guide them, still provide for them, still see them safely home. The discovery of the hidden berry patch behind the turtle-shaped rock marked a turning point in their journey. It was a moment of profound affirmation, a feeling of being held and guided by the benevolent hands of their history. The feeling of quiet joy and deep gratitude settled over the family as they carefully harvested the bright, tart cranberries, their red a startlingly beautiful contrast to the deep green moss that carpeted the ground. With their baskets now truly full, laden with a diverse and colorful bounty of persimmons, elderberries, and cranberries, the urgent, forward-moving phase of their journey was complete. They had raced the frost and won. They had adapted to the unexpected and been rewarded with a gift from the past. Now, a new phase of work began, one that was slower, more stationary, and rooted in the ancient and patient art of preservation. The primary task was no longer to gather, but to transform the fleeting abundance of this autumn harvest into a stable, lasting security that would see them through the long, lean months of the coming winter. This was the moment their stability and knowledge reached its peak, a time for the quiet alchemy of turning fresh fruit into durable sustenance. They did not stay on the high, windy ridge. Guided by a lifetime of knowing the land, the father led them down into a small, sheltered cove, a place cupped in a gentle curve of the hillside, facing south to catch the day's warmth and protected from the persistent north wind by a thick stand of pine and hemlock. A small, clear stream, born from the same spring that fed the berry patch above, trickled through the center of the cove, its gentle murmuring a constant, soothing presence. This would be their main camp, their workshop for the next several days. Here, they would build not a temporary shelter, but a small, functional homestead dedicated to the sacred and essential work of preservation. The first and most critical element was the fire, not the quick, hot fire they used for cooking their daily meals, but a different kind of fire altogether, a slow fire, a fire that smoldered rather than blazed, a fire designed to produce a steady, gentle heat and a continuous, flavorful smoke. The father, a master of this pyrotechnic art, began by selecting the right fuel. He gathered wood not for its ability to burn hot and fast, but for its capacity to burn low and slow. He chose seasoned hardwoods, oak for its long-lasting coals, and hickory for the sweet, savory smoke it produced. A smoke that would not only help to dry the fruit, but would also infuse it with a delicious and protective flavor that would deter mold and insects. He built the fire in a long, shallow trench, rather than a circular pit, a design that would allow the heat and smoke to be distributed evenly over a large area. He kindled a small, hot fire at one end of the trench, and then slowly, carefully, began to cover the glowing coals with larger pieces of hickory, restricting the airflow just enough to prevent the wood from bursting into flame. The result was a long, glowing bed of embers that produced a steady, shimmering curtain of heat and a thick, aromatic plume of white smoke that rose lazily into the cool. still air and hung in a fragrant cloud beneath the canopy of the sheltering pines. While the father tended to his slow fire, the mother and grandmother began the meticulous work of preparing the fruit. The boy worked alongside them, his small hands carefully mimicking their practiced movements. They sat together on a soft pine needle carpet, the overflowing baskets arranged around them, a vibrant palette of autumn colors. The persimmons, which were soft and almost liquid inside their wrinkled skins, were the easiest to prepare. Some they left whole, knowing the slow drying process would concentrate their sweetness into a dense, chewy confection. Others, they gently split open and laid skin down, exposing their rich, dark pulp to the warm air. The elderberries were carefully destemmed, the tiny individual berries separated from their stalks and spread out in a thin, single layer on large, flat pieces of birch bark. The pawpaws they had gathered at the very beginning of their journey, which were now at the peak of their soft, custardy ripeness, required the most delicate handling. Using a mussel shell as a small, curved spoon, the mother carefully scooped the fragrant, yellow pulp away from the large, dark seeds, spreading the soft flesh onto thin, smooth sheets of wood veneer she had carefully peeled from a basswood log. Each fruit required a different touch, a different understanding of its unique character. It was a slow, meditative process, a work that required focus and a gentle hand. The rhythmic scrape of the shell against the pawpaw seed, the soft rustle of the elderberries being spread on the bark, the quiet conversation between mother and grandmother, these were the sounds of their workshop, a symphony of purposeful, life-sustaining activity. Once the fruit was prepared, the next step was to build the drying racks. The father had already cut several long, straight saplings of green maple, a wood that could withstand the heat without burning easily. He drove forked sticks into the ground on either side of the long, smoldering fire trench. He then laid the long maple poles across these forked supports, creating a sturdy, waist-high framework that ran the entire length of the fire. On top of this framework, they laid a lattice of smaller green sticks, creating a wide, stable platform suspended directly over the rising heat and smoke. It was a simple, elegant, and incredibly effective piece of engineering, a technology perfected over thousands of years, built entirely from the materials the forest provided. Carefully, reverently, they began to arrange the prepared fruit on this vast drying rack. The thin slices of pawpaw, the whole and halved persimmons, the sheets of elderberries on their bark trays, each was given its own space, its own place in the warm, smoky air. Soon, the entire rack was covered in a beautiful, colorful mosaic of the harvest. The work was precise, almost ceremonial. They were not just laying out food, they were arranging the future, securing the well-being of their family for the months to come. And as the gentle heat from the slow fire began its work, a new and wonderful aroma began to fill the small cove. It was a complex and deeply comforting scent, a blend of the sweet, caramelizing sugars of the persimmons, the fruity tang of the elderberries, the tropical perfume of the pawpaws, and all of it woven through with the savory, delicious fragrance of the hickory smoke. The smell was the very essence of autumn, of preservation, of the deep, satisfying peace that comes from a full larder and a job well done. It filled the air, clung to their clothes, and settled around them like a warm, invisible blanket. For the next 2 days, the slow fire was their constant companion, the heart of their camp. It was never allowed to go out. Day and night, one of them was awake to tend it, to add another piece of hickory at just the right moment, to ensure the coals glowed but never flamed. They took turns sleeping, their lives revolving around the needs of this slow, transformative process. During the day, while the fruit dried, they performed other quiet tasks. The mother worked on turning the deerskin of a recently hunted animal into soft, pliable leather. The father carved a set of new arrow shafts from the straight-grained wood of the serviceberry. The boy, under his grandmother's tutelage, learned to weave a strong, functional cordage from the fibers of the milkweed stalk. The camp was a hive of quiet, productive industry, every moment filled with the calm, rhythmic hum of contented work. They constantly monitored the fruit on the rack, their fingers and eyes expert judges of the drying process. The mother would turn the persimmons, ensuring they dried evenly. The father would shift the pawpaw slices, moving the ones on the edges closer to the center. They watched as the vibrant colors of the fresh fruit slowly deepened and darkened, as their moisture evaporated, as their forms condensed and hardened. They were watching the act of turning fleeting, perishable abundance into lasting, durable security, a promise of warmth and sweetness in the deepest cold of winter. This was the pinnacle of their journey, a moment of perfect synthesis between their knowledge of the land, their skill with their hands, and their deep, patient trust in the ancient processes that had sustained their people since time immemorial. The sweet smoke curling up from the slow fire was more than just a method of preservation. It was an offering of thanks, a fragrant prayer for the life the land had so generously provided. On the morning of the third day in the sheltered cove, a different quality of light and air signaled the end of their preservation work. The slow fire had burned down to a fine gray ash, its purpose fulfilled. The sweet, heavy aroma of hickory smoke had dissipated, leaving behind a clean, crisp autumn scent. The fruit, once soft and plump with moisture, was now transformed. The persimmons were dark and leathery, their sugars concentrated into a dense, chewy sweetness. The pawpaw pulp had become thin, brittle crisps of a deep golden color. The elderberries were tiny, hard pellets, their tart flavor locked away, waiting for water to reawaken them. The work of transformation was complete. Now, all that remained was the journey home. The feeling in the camp was one of quiet accomplishment, a deep, bone-weary satisfaction mixed with the gentle, persistent pull of home. It was time to return to the familiar embrace of their permanent village, to the warmth of their lodge, and the company of their extended kin. The homeward journey would be a different kind of pilgrimage, not a race against time or a quest for provision, but a slow, deliberate procession, a return to the heart of their world. Packing for the return was a careful and reverent process. The dried fruits, now greatly reduced in volume and weight but immeasurably increased in value, were the precious cargo at the center of all their efforts. The mother took charge of this crucial task, her knowledge of proper storage a vital final step in the chain of preservation. She lined their woven baskets with the large, dry leaves of the sycamore tree, leaves known to have properties that help to ward off mold and pests. Then, she began to layer the fruit. A layer of dark persimmons, a layer of leaves, a layer of the tangy cranberries, another layer of leaves, and so on. The brittle pawpaw crisps were packed into a separate, rigid bark container to prevent them from being crushed. The tiny elderberries were poured into a tightly woven bag of basswood fiber. Each type of fruit was given its own specific, careful consideration. When the baskets were full, their contents were no longer just food. They were a concentrated store of sunlight, of time, of knowledge, and hard work. They were the physical embodiment of the family's resilience, a tangible promise of life and well-being through the cold, dark months ahead. And the baskets were heavy, heavier than they had been at any point on the journey out. The deerskin packs, filled not just with the fruit but with the family's tools and sleeping hides, were now formidable burdens. The journey home would be a test of a different kind of strength, a test of endurance and of quiet, communal support. When they were finally ready, they stood for a moment in the now empty cove. They dismantled the drying rack, scattering the green maple poles back into the woods to be reclaimed by the forest. The father carefully filled the fire trench with earth, erasing the scar of their presence, leaving the place as close to how they had found it as possible. The grandmother offered a final, silent prayer of thanks to the spirit of the place for the shelter and abundance it had provided. Then, they turned their faces south and began to walk, their steps slower now, more deliberate, weighed down by the satisfying physical burden of their success. The landscape they moved through was a world visibly changed from the one they had traversed on their journey north. The early autumn that had just been a whisper on the wind was now a full-throated declaration. The forest was ablaze with color. The maples were a fiery scarlet, the hickories a brilliant, buttery yellow, the oaks a deep, russet bronze. The air, which had been warm and hazy on their way out, was now consistently cool and sharp, and the sunlight that filtered through the thinning canopy had a clear, golden, almost liquid quality. The world felt both vibrant and fragile, a final, glorious burst of life before the long sleep of winter. This was a visual feast, a final farewell from the land that filled their senses and lifted their spirits, even as their bodies began to feel the strain of the heavy loads. Their pace was necessarily slower now, governed by the strength of the grandmother and the shorter legs of the boy. The first day of travel was a quiet struggle, a process of their bodies acclimating to the new weight. Muscles that had been accustomed to the lighter packs of the outward journey now ached with a dull, persistent fire. The straps of the deerskin packs dug into their shoulders, but there was no complaint. This was the satisfying ache of work well done, a physical sensation that was directly connected to the security they were carrying. Each painful step was a confirmation of their success. As they walked, the small communal acts of support that bound them together as a family became more pronounced, more essential. The father, though carrying the heaviest load himself, would often stop and, without a word, use his walking staff to gently lift the weight of his wife's or his mother's pack for a few moments, giving their shoulders a brief respite. The mother, in turn, was constantly watchful of the boy, making sure his smaller pack was riding correctly, adjusting a strap, offering him a drink from the water skin before he even realized he was thirsty. When they stopped to rest, the first thing they did was help each other unshoulder their heavy burdens, the relief of the weight lifting a shared, grateful sigh. They tended to each other's needs with a quiet, unspoken intuition. The mother would notice a hot spot on her husband's heel and would insist on stopping to apply a soothing poultice of crushed plantain leaf before a blister could form. The grandmother, sensing the boy's flagging energy, would produce a single, perfect dried persimmon from a small pouch. Its intense sweetness, a magical burst of energy that would carry him through the next leg of the journey. These small, constant gestures of care were the invisible sinews that held them together, turning their individual struggles into a shared endeavor. They were not just a group of individuals walking in the same direction. They were a single organism, each part supporting the others, their collective strength far greater than the sum of their individual efforts. The nights on the journey home were colder now. The lean-to shelters they built were more substantial, with thicker walls of hemlock boughs and deeper beds of pine needles to insulate them from the frozen ground. The fires they built were kept burning a little larger, a little longer into the night, their warmth a vital comfort against the encroaching cold. In the evenings, as they sat close to the flames, their tired bodies soaking in the heat, a deep sense of peace would settle over them. The food they ate was simple, a fish caught from the river, a handful of nuts, but it tasted more delicious than any feast, seasoned as it was with a full day of hard, meaningful work. The physical exertion of the day made sleep come easily and deeply. They would drift off to the sound of the crackling fire and the gentle murmur of the river, their bodies weary but their spirits calm and secure. As they drew closer to home, a new energy began to infuse their steps. The landscape started to become more familiar. They recognized a particular bend in the river, a uniquely shaped rock formation, a grove of trees where they had camped in seasons past. Each familiar landmark was a milestone, a signpost pulling them onward, a reminder of the warmth and rest that lay just ahead. The anticipation of their return began to outweigh the physical weariness. The thought of their own lodge, of the familiar faces of their kin, of a night spent sleeping under a solid roof instead of the stars, was a powerful and alluring motivator. The journey under the weight of the harvest was a quiet crucible, a trial of endurance, and a testament to their strength, not just as individuals, but as a family. It was the final, arduous chapter in their seasonal story, the long, slow, and satisfying walk from the wild abundance of the harvest back to the heart of their community. Their heavy baskets, a promise of shared feasts, and the deep, enduring security of a winter well provided for. On the afternoon of the final day's walk, the first sign of home appeared. It was not a sight, but a smell, carried to them on a gentle southern breeze. It was the faint, familiar, and deeply welcome scent of wood smoke, not the wild, hickory-scented smoke of their own preservation fire, but the blended aroma of a dozen small cooking fires, the smell of community, the very perfume of home. A little further on, they topped a small rise in the trail and saw it, nestled in a wide, gentle bend of the river, where the land was fertile and protected from the worst of the winter winds, was their village. It was not a large settlement, just a collection of sturdy, bark-covered lodges, their domed shapes echoing the curves of the surrounding hills. And from the smoke hole in the roof of each lodge rose a thin, gray-blue column of smoke, a visible sign of life, of warmth, of the families who dwelt within. To an outsider's eye, it might have seemed a simple, primitive scene, but to the returning family, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. It was the center of their universe, the fixed point to which their travels always returned. It was safety, kinship, and belonging, all made manifest in the quiet, reassuring sight of smoke rising into the autumn sky. Their arrival was not met with fanfare or grand celebration. There was no crowd gathering at the edge of the village to welcome them with cheers. The rhythms of village life were too subtle, too deeply ingrained for such displays. Instead, their return was a quiet, gentle reabsorption into the life of the community. As they walked down the main path between the lodges, people emerged from their homes not in a rush, but with slow, welcoming smiles. An uncle, mending a snowshoe frame in the afternoon sun, looked up and gave a deep, knowing nod of acknowledgement. A cousin, scraping a deer hide stretched on a frame, called out a soft-spoken greeting. Children, playing a game with stones in the dust, paused their play to watch the travelers with wide, curious eyes before being called over by their own parents. It was a welcome expressed not in loud words, but in 100 small gestures of recognition and quiet pleasure. The news of their return spread through the village like a gentle ripple in a calm pond. Their long absence had been noted, their purpose understood, and their safe return was a cause for a shared, communal sense of relief and satisfaction. They went first to their own lodge, a dwelling that was larger and more permanent than the temporary shelters of their journey, but built on the same principles of natural harmony. A framework of bent saplings was covered in wide, overlapping sheets of elm bark, sewn together with basswood cordage to create a weatherproof, breathable skin. A low, curved doorway covered with a heavy hide faced east to greet the morning Sunday. Inside, the space was a single, large, circular room, the floor covered with soft, woven reed mats. In the very center was the fire pit, a shallow, clay-lined depression in the earth, its ashes cold and gray from their long absence. The air inside was still and cool, holding the faint, familiar scent of wood smoke, of dried herbs, of their own lives. It was the scent of home. With weary sighs of relief, they unshouldered their heavy packs for the last time, the thick deerskin straps leaving deep, red indentations on their tired shoulders. The weight, which had been their constant companion for days, was gone, and in its place was a feeling of lightness, of arrival. They leaned the heavy baskets against the curved inner wall of the lodge, their precious contents safe and secure at last. Before they rested, however, there was one final, crucial task to perform. The bounty they had gathered was not just for their own family, it was a contribution to the community's collective winter store. The father took one of the largest baskets, the one filled with the sweet, dark persimmons, and carried it to a special lodge that stood in the center of the village. This was the storehouse, a structure built to be exceptionally dry and protected from pests, where the community's surplus food was kept. He was met at the door by an elder, a woman whose duty it was to oversee the winter provisions. She accepted his offering not with effusive thanks, but with a grave, appreciative nod. His family had done their part. Their hard work would now help to ensure that no one in the village went hungry, that the children and the elderly would have a taste of sweetness during the barren months. It was a simple, powerful act of communal responsibility, the bedrock on which their society was built. With that final duty done, true rest could begin. The father returned to his own lodge, and with a skill born of 1,000 repetitions, he kindled a new fire in the central pit. As the flames caught and grew, a living warmth began to fill the cool, still air, pushing back the shadows, transforming the empty lodge back into a home. That evening, the entire community came together, not for a formal feast, but for a simple shared meal. The central fire in the village commons was built up high, and families brought their own bowls to be filled from a large clay pot that simmered over the flames. The stew was a humble but nourishing affair, made from corn, beans, and squash, the three sacred sisters of their agriculture, flavored with venison and wild herbs. But tonight, it was different. To celebrate the travelers' return and to share in the first fruits of their labor, the mother had brought a small pouch of the newly dried elderberries. She crumbled them into the pot, and as they rehydrated in the hot broth, they released their deep, wine-like color and their tart, fruity flavor, transforming the familiar, everyday stew into something special, a taste of the wild abundance of the fading year. Families sat together in small groups around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering light, the quiet murmur of conversation a comforting, human sound against the vast, dark backdrop of the autumn night. Stories were shared, news from the village, tales from the traveler's journey. The father recounted the story of the bear and the stripped cranberry bushes, and the grandmother, her voice filled with a quiet pride, retold the story of her own grandmother's wisdom, the story that had led them to the hidden patch behind the Turtle Rock. The circle was complete. The journey that had begun with an urgent whisper on the wind had ended here, in the warm, communal circle by the home fire. The resilience of the family, built on generations of knowledge, keen observation, and hard collaborative work, had brought them through every challenge, from the threat of a killing frost to the disappointment of a barren harvest. They had returned not just with food for the body, but with stories for the spirit, with lessons learned and ancient wisdom reaffirmed. They were home, surrounded by the warmth of their fire and the safety of their kin, as the boy sat nestled between his mother and father, his belly full of the warm, berry-sweetened stew. A profound sense of peace and security washed over him. He felt the solid, comforting presence of his family. He saw the friendly, familiar faces of his people in the firelight, and he understood, in a deep, unspoken way, the beautiful, intricate web of care and knowledge that held his world together. The cold of winter was coming, but here, in the heart of his village, he was safe, he was provided for, he was home. The accomplishment was not just his family's, but everyone's. The harvest belonged to the community, and the security it promised was a blanket that would cover them all. Later that evening, long after the communal meal had ended and the families had retired to their own lodges, a deep and profound quiet settled over the village. The large central fire had been banked, its embers glowing a dull, sleepy red in the darkness. The only sounds were the gentle, rhythmic murmur of the river flowing past on its eternal journey, and the occasional, distant call of a hunting owl. Outside, the autumn wind, colder now, rustled through the dry, skeletal leaves of the cornstalks in the fallow fields and whispered around the curved walls of the bark lodges. The world was growing colder, preparing itself for the long sleep of winter, but inside the family's lodge, there was only warmth and a heavy, satisfying peace. The small fire in the central pit had burned down to a bed of soft, radiant coals, casting a gentle, flickering orange light that pushed the shadows into the far corners of the circular room. The air was warm and still, filled with the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke and the lingering aroma of the berry-sweetened stew. The hard work was done. The harvest was home. The journey was over. All that was left was to rest in the security that had been so diligently earned. The family was settled on their sleeping platforms, thick piles of soft deer and bear hides laid over a springy mattress of cattail fluff and dried grasses. The father was already asleep, his deep, steady breathing a comforting rhythm in the quiet lodge. The mother sat mending a small tear in the boy's moccasin, her hands moving with a slow, practiced grace in the firelight, her mind calm and at ease. The boy, though his body was heavy with a deep weariness from the long journey, was not yet asleep. He was too full of the day's quiet excitement, his mind still tracing the familiar paths of the forest, still seeing the brilliant red of the cranberries, still feeling the immense relief of arriving home. He lay watching the dancing light of the coals paint shifting patterns on the domed roof above him, a silent, personal light show that was as familiar and soothing as his mother's heartbeat. The grandmother, who had been sitting in quiet contemplation, her back resting against a support post of the lodge, stirred. She reached into a small, finely woven pouch at her side, a bag decorated with intricate patterns of dyed porcupine quills, and brought out a single, perfect dried persimmon. It was dark and wrinkled, its leathery skin dusted with a fine, natural bloom of sugar that glittered in the firelight. It was a small, unassuming thing, but it was also a repository of memory, a symbol of their entire journey. She held the persimmon in the palm of her hand, her old wrinkled fingers cradling it gently. She looked at her grandson and saw the wakefulness in his wide, dark eyes. A soft, knowing smile touched her lips. She knew that this was a moment not for enforced sleep, but for one last, quiet lesson. This was the time for the planting of the seed, the time to transform the physical experience of the journey into a story, into a piece of wisdom that would take root in the boy's mind and grow with him for the rest of his life. Her voice, when she began to speak, was even softer than usual, a low, melodic murmur that blended with the gentle crackle of the coals and the whisper of the wind outside. It was a voice designed not to excite, but to soothe, to draw the listener into a state of calm, focused attention. "I will tell you the story of this fruit," she began, her gaze holding the boy's. "It is an old story, and a true one. It is the story of patience, and of the sweetness that can be found on the other side of hardship." She turned the persimmon over in her hand, its dark, wrinkled form, a small, dark star in the firelight. "In the beginning of its life," she said, "the persimmon is like a young, impatient person. It is proud. It dresses itself in a beautiful, bright color and says to the world, 'Look at me. I am ready. Come and take my gift.' But it is a trick. Inside, its heart is hard and its spirit is bitter. It has not yet learned that true gifts are not given so easily. It has not learned humility." The boy listened, his imagination captured by the idea of the fruit as a person. He remembered the shocking, mouth-puckering bitterness of the first one he had tasted, and he understood. "So the persimmon waits on its branch, all through the warm, sunny days," the grandmother continued. "It soaks up the strength of the sun, and it drinks the rain, and it grows. But still, it holds on to its bitterness, guarding its true sweetness like a secret treasure. The deer come and nibble the leaves of the tree, but they will not touch the fruit. The opossum climbs the branches at night, but he knows to leave the fruit alone. They know its secret. They know it is not yet time." The fire popped softly, sending a small shower of sparks upward into the darkness of the smoke hole. The mother had finished her mending, and now she, too, was listening, her hands resting quietly in her lap, a gentle smile on her face. She had heard this story many times before, but it never lost its simple, profound power. And then, the grandmother's voice dropped to a near whisper. "A change comes. A cold messenger arrives on a wind from the north. The stars grow sharp, and the nights grow long and silent. The proud green world of summer begins to fade, and finally, the frost arrives, a visitor as white and silent as a ghost. It touches everything. It lays its cold hand on the persimmon." She paused, letting the image settle in the boy's mind. He could almost feel the crystalline touch of the frost on his own skin, and the proud fruit is afraid. It thinks this is the end. It thinks the cold has come to kill it, to steal its life. But the frost is not a killer. It is a teacher. Its cold touch is not an act of violence, but an act of magic. The frost speaks to the bitterness inside the fruit and says, "Your time of guarding is over. Let go. It is time to be who you were always meant to be." and the bitterness, in the face of this great cold power, finally surrenders. It dissolves, it transforms, and in its place, the deep, hidden sweetness is unlocked and allowed to flood the entire fruit. She held the persimmon out for him to see again. "This," she said, "is what you hold in your hand after the frost has done its work. Not the bitter, proud fruit of summer, but the humble, sweet, and wrinkled fruit of late autumn. Its hardness is gone, replaced by a soft and generous spirit. It has learned the great lesson that true sweetness often requires a touch of hardship, a trial of cold, to be brought into the world." The story was over. The lesson had been given, wrapped in the gentle metaphor of the fruit's journey. The grandmother placed the dried persimmon into the boy's small open hand. It felt warm from her own touch, its leathery skin holding a faint, residual heat. It was no longer just a piece of food. It was a story he could hold, a physical reminder of the wisdom he had just received. The story of the fruit was now his own. It was a seed, planted in the fertile ground of his young mind, a seed that contained the lessons of patience, of trust in the seasons, and of the sweetness that can follow the cold. And so, the grandmother's voice softens, becoming part of the gentle sounds of the lodge. The story of the persimmon is now safe with the children, planted like a seed to be carried into their own futures. Outside, the cold autumn wind may blow, but here, inside, there is only the deep, glowing warmth of the central fire, the quiet breathing of family, and the heavy, satisfying peace of work well done. The baskets are full, the body is tired, the spirit is calm. There is nothing left to do now but let go. Feel the warmth of that fire in your own room. Let the gentle story settle around you like a soft hide blanket. The journey is over. The harvest is home. All that remains is to rest, to let the quiet of the long night cradle you, and to sleep. Just rest now.